I'm John, researcher at the Health Economics Research Centre at NDPH, and I'm going to talk about discrete choice experiments this morning as well. So, just by way of agenda, to start at the start, like what is a discrete choice experiment? Seems like a pretty good place to start to me. Then kind of discrete choice experiments and their use in health. Then it got to a little bit of motivation. So why would we use one of these things? A couple of case studies for you guys. So I do a lot of work in non-communicable diseases, so things like smoking and food shopping. Then talk a little bit about modelling and modelling data, particularly in a package called Apollo in R, which I use as well. And then kind of wrap everything together and yeah, stop there. So what is a discrete choice experiment? Well, clues kind of in the name. So discrete, give people a finite set of products from which to choose. Choice, ask them to choose their sort of preferred option among those alternatives. And experiments, we vary what we call the attributes or the features or characteristics of those products. So we vary those across experimental choices. So what we get from these experiments, so people making those individual choices allows us to kind of unpick their preferences for the products and the alternatives. We can derive willingness to pay from those if we have a price characteristic or a price attribute. And we can also use choice models with our experimental data to forecast or predict choices in the future. So if you change certain things about those alternatives, how would that change people's choices? We can predict that using our models. So this is kind of what a typical discrete choice experiment scenario looks like. In this case, it's tobacco choices, and I'm asking individuals to choose between packets of cigarettes. So I have two alternatives. So that's cigarette packet 1 and cigarette packet 2. And then I'm going to describe those by their attributes or their characteristics. In this case, the attributes are flavour, so tobacco or menthol, the level of nicotine in them, so high or medium in this case, the sort of health harm expressed as life years lost to the average smoker, and finally the price, which you probably can't see at the bottom, apologies, it's a bit small. And then what I'm going to do is between each experimental task, I'm always going to keep the alternatives the same. So they're always two, in this case, 2 packets of cigarettes. I'm also going to keep those attributes the same as well. So there'll always be a flavour and a nicotine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to vary the levels of those, which is what I'm doing here. So you can see that the levels of nicotine, for example, change across choice scenarios, the prices change, etc. But not all things have to change. So the flavour of these maintains the same across those choices. And all I'm going to do throughout the experiment is keep on varying all of those alternatives, asking people to keep choosing their favourite as the alternatives change. And from that's going to allow me to estimate a model on that data, and I can elicit those preferences. So typically, in a discrete choice experiment, broadly think of it as in 3 stages. So the first thing is the experiment itself, like I just showed you, and that generates the choice data. So remember that in each choice scenario, we know which alternative the individual chose, and we know the characteristics of those. We also know which alternative they didn't choose, and we know the characteristics of those. So that gives us a nice data set. So we have all my individuals, we have all the choices they made, we have all the data about those choices. I can always also collect information about the respondents themselves, so their age and gender, etc. And all of that we can use at stage 2, which is our choice model. So of course, once we have the data, we want to put it in the model, and that allows us to estimate preferences. And then in stage 3, we can use that fitted model to do various things. So again, we can predict choices, or we can calculate willingness to pay. So how about their use in health? And I think this is probably quite useful to people in the group, because we use these things all through health. So first of all, do bear in mind, and this is kind of a little bugbear of mine, in health, people sort of confuse 2 terms. One is discrete choice experiment, and one is a choice model. So I have a discrete choice experiment, which is the experiment I give to people. And then I have a choice model, which is a econometric model I use with that data from the experiment. But remember that I don't have to have data from an experiment to use a choice model. So if I'm interested, for example, in smoking choices, I could use a discrete choice experiment, get some data and put that on a choice model. But I could also get choice data from real world settings, maybe scanner data or internet sales, and I could use that in a choice model. So it doesn't have to be the case that a discrete choice experiment always means choice model. But we use these for all sorts of things in health. Lots and lots of applications of these models. And the kinds of things we use them for include things like what I'm interested in, health behaviours, so smoking, drinking, food, etc. Also clinical settings, so what kind of treatment options people choose, or whether or not to choose to partake in a screening programme for cancer, something like that. Designing randomised controlled trials, so I might want to estimate a non-inferiority margin for a clinical trial that I might want to set up. Policy choices is a popular one. So let's say public support for various taxes I might impose or various subsidies that I might impose. And finally, quality of life, which used in health economics quite often. So there are lots of these studies. So in health economics alone, more than 600 in a series of literature reviews. And then if I go beyond health economics to just talk about health scientists, then even more. Lots and lots and lots, very widely applied. And indeed, this is a recent literature review of choice models in lots of different sectors, and health has now overtaken transport and indeed the other sectors as the most they're used most widely in health versus anywhere else. So we're using these things lots and lots and lots and lots in health. So just thought I'd give you guys a sort of example of the kind of practical applications of some of these experiments in the models. So the first one is commissioning. So this is these are reports for HTA. So this is NICE, which is, as you all know, National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. And they use these preference studies in their health HTA determination. So whether or not we are commissioning goods on the NHS is determined in part by results from these, because I need to use them in these studies. And again, this is an example too. This is calculating QALYs. So here we have measures of quality of life, which are typically multidimensional. But then I have to decide, I can use choice experiments to work out what the general population thinks about each of those dimensions, and then use that in the calculation for my quality of life. So maybe, for example, in an EQ5D, I might have anxiety and depression and mobility. Well, do people do people care more basically about mobility or about anxiety and depression? And feeding that into the calculation helps us get more accurate more accurate measurement of quality of life, which again we use in determinations of whether or not we should be commissioning things. Okay, so why should we use a DCE? What are some nice things? So of course we can inform many health behaviours, but there's lots of useful things that we can do these. So as I said before, we can predict the impact of policies prior to implementation, and I'll show you guys some of that work in the tobacco setting in a few slides time. We can examine the trade-off between attributes. So again, if I have a tobacco experiment where I have a price or say a flavour, and I can then work out which of those two things is more important for smokers in that setting. And that allows me to work out whether, as a policy, it would be taxes or flavours would have more impact on people's choices. They're really, really flexible, so you can sort of tailor these things to the research questions that you're interested in. And that can be almost anything. What's really nice is you can incorporate external data into our analyses as well to kind of understand that more richly. So, of course, we could use survey data that we collect alongside our experiment. So let's say I collect age along with that, and then I can use that in my models. So I can, let's say I'm going to model preferences for flavours in cigarettes, but I could also see how those preferences vary as a function of age. So that older people have stronger or weaker preferences for flavours in tobacco products. So it's really, really useful behavioural information that we can pick up and we can use in our analysis as well. We get causal effects of attributes on choices. And I've got a star there because I want to be very precise about what I mean. In a discrete choice experiment, we have experimental variation of the attributes, and we have because they're experimentally varied, I can get a causal estimate of that experimental variation on the experimental choices. Sadly, what I don't have is external validity. So within the confines of the experiment, we get the causal effect, and that's what the star's doing. So that's not the same as saying choices in the real world. And finally, they're really well suited to health settings. So essentially, Dan McFadden, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, has a book chapter, and he kind of makes the point that, well, these methods tend to be really good when the choices are kind of familiar to respondents and well described by their attributes and fairly simply put. And in a lot of health settings, I think that's the case as well. And then Matt Quaife and others have had a few papers where they've shown there's a really high correspondence between what people said they were going to do in experiments in health and what they went on to do when we had those real choices as well. So we have good, reasonable evidence that these things are pretty close to reality. They're also good because we can collect really up-to-date data. So it doesn't take me very much time to kind of set one of these experiments up and get going. They're relatively inexpensive. It's always a bonus. Easy to administer relative to other things, clinical trial, for example. You can collect data that may not be available elsewhere. So let's say I have a large nationally representative data set on smoking, and I'm interested in nicotine levels, but what if that large data set didn't collect nicotine? There's not much I can do, right? That's of course not the case in experiment, where we have control over what's in our either experiment or our survey alongside it. And the nice thing is that choice models have evolved, really to quite a sophisticated level now over the last 20 years or so. You can get really rich behavioural information through our modelling as well. However, sadly, they're not, like any study design, they're not without their flaws and limitations, and we have to be really mindful of those. So we have things like hypothetical bias. So that is what people tell me they're going to do in an experiment isn't necessarily what they're going to go and do in real life. So that's always a big criticism of these methods, and well justified, I think. Underreporting or misreporting. So people might answer a certain way in an experiment for, I don't know, reasons of social stigma. They might tell me they don't smoke or smoke as much as they do, if they do. You might have gaming. For example, if I'm asking someone about their preferences for flood defences, they might tell me that they care more about them than they actually do because they want me to put up a flood defence. The sample sizes are often quite small, so that's normally not so much of a problem when I'm thinking about powering a choice model, but that is more of a problem when I think about generalizability. So if I'm trying to make statements about the behaviour of people in the general population, and I have a sample of 200 people, I'm quite limited to do that, or much more limited than I would be if I had a sample of 20,000 people, for example. And then we have things like sampling issues, like selection bias. So is there a certain kind of person that chooses to take an experiment? If I am collecting data online, is there a certain type of person that is chooses to take an experiment on an online platform? And is that kind of person different to those in the general population? Well, if they are, or the population I'm interested in, and if they are, we have potential selection bias issues. And of course, we need a lot of technical knowledge for both the design stage and the modelling as well. It's not sort of costless, I think, in that regard. Okay, so let's look at a few examples now. So my apologies, I'm going to engage in what I shall refer to as shameless self-promotion for a few slides, but this is some work we've done in tobacco. And we're interested in the flavours, amongst other attributes, mainly the flavours, and just flavours, sorry. So as a sort of summary and background of the study, the FDA, which is the governing body in the States overseeing the tobacco market, so they have regulatory authority over flavours in tobacco products. They do other things as well, but one of the things they could do is control flavours. And they're seeking to implement flavours policies. But of course, what they want to know is which flavours policies should they implement to maximise public health? Now, at the minute, or at the time they're interested in doing it, there was no evidence because those bans haven't been in place. For example, if we think about e-cigarette flavours, I could ban any kind of e-cigarette flavours or none of them. Cigarettes, of course, are still allowed in menthol, but not allowed in other flavours, so you could still ban menthol. So the FDA were interested in which combinations of those bans would be most impactful in improving public health. Now, because that data is not available, because it doesn't exist, one thing I can use is a discrete choice experiment, because I can put e-cigarette flavours into the design, which means I can get data on people's preferences for those, which means I can model that in a choice model, which means I can do the predictions. So looking at the different flavours. And that's what we did. So this was the experimental design we look like that we set up. So our alternatives were e-cigarettes and cigarettes. And we described those by 4 attributes. So first of all was the flavour of those products. So yeah, in e-cigarettes we had tobacco, menthol, fruit and sweet. They were the most common. In combustible cigarettes, just plain tobacco and menthol, because at the time, and it's still true today, non-menthol, non-tobacco flavors are banned in cigarettes in the US. So you used to be able to get apple flavor and cherry flavor cigarette, but they were banned several years ago. So we want to reflect that realism in our design. So that's how we did it. The health harm in terms of how many life years were lost by the average smoker. That's generally thought to be about 10 years for cigarettes. But of course, we don't know so much about e-cigarettes. So we allowed that to vary. So 5 years or 2 years, or just, we don't know. The level of nicotine. So again, for e-cigarettes, could be high, medium, low, or nicotine-free. And nicotine-free cigarettes don't exist. So we didn't have those in the design either. So for cigarettes, it was just high, medium, low levels of nicotine. And finally, prices. So $4.99, $7.99, $10.99, and $13.99. So they were the prices. So this is what the choice tasks look like. So that's on the right here. So we had all of those. We had two options for both of the alternatives. So 2 cigarettes and 2 e-cigarettes, and we described them by those 4 attributes, and we allowed the levels of those attributes to vary between each of the choice tasks. Well, we took 2,000 people. They answered 12 choice tasks each. We took quotas from nationally representative data. So that was the CPT-TUS. So our sample looked as best it could like a sample of smokers from the general population. And we used multinomial logistic regressions, or multinomial logit. They were our choice models. So this is what the result looked like. So that was our experiment. We got our data. We used it in our MNL, our multinomial logit model. And these are what the results look like. So broadly speaking, there are lots of stars, I won't go into details, but what you need to know is on the left. So pretty much smokers preferred cigarettes to e-cigarettes, which I don't think is a surprising result. We know from sales data that cigarettes are purchased much more heavily than e-cigarettes, in which case we should expect to see an overall preference for them, which we did. Lower prices preferred, good, it's common sense. Medium nicotine or level of nicotine was preferred to high nicotine or low and no nicotine. And of course, more health or better health products were preferred as well. So nothing too surprising there. I think, so this is the heterogeneity analysis. So here we're looking at how preferences for flavored cigarettes and flavored e-cigarettes vary as a function of individual characteristics. So again, we're using the data we collected in the survey about respondents and using that to try to understand how preferences vary for those products as well. So again, I'm not going to go through everything here, but I did want to pick out some what I think are some really interesting findings. The first is this one here. So we see a preference for menthol cigarettes amongst African American smokers, and that's exactly what we should expect to see, because we know from nationally representative data that use of menthol cigarettes is disproportionately high in African American population. So that's exactly what we should expect to see here, and thankfully that's what we did. Now, what we didn't know at the time were there also preferences for those same flavors in e-cigarettes? But that's exactly what we can get here as well. So we have a nice nice way of making sure that our modeling is realistic or reflecting patterns that we see in the real world, as well as finding new information that we didn't know before. So that's really good. So this one is, so what about preferences for products by people that tell us they're vapors only, so only e-cigarette users? So what we want to do here is look at this number here. So this is a preference for tobacco e-cigarettes, and the reference category is tobacco cigarettes. So on average, people don't like them by 1.12. But if you are a vapor only, you prefer them by 1.22. So on average, that's positive. So 1.22 minus 1.12 is 0.01. So all else equal, those people that tell us they only use e-cigarettes prefer outright e-cigarettes to cigarettes. Good. It's exactly what you expect to see, because that's entirely that's entirely keeping with our expectations. So you have a nice realistic model here. And this one I think is really interesting as well. So lower SR health is lower self-reported health. And here we're seeing a positive preference for menthol cigarettes. But again, that's kind of in keeping with, there's a known misconception in tobacco, that is, people have this misconception that menthol's healthier, or like it has medicinal qualities or something. And based on that, or reflecting on that, I think it makes a ton of sense that people that have low self-reported health, i.e. think they're ill, prefer menthol cigarettes, probably because they think they're kind of a little bit healthier. Okay, so that's what our preferences look like. Next, of course, we want to get back to our research question. That is, which ban should I implement? So here we can use the model to run a series of scenarios and look what happens to the market shares of each of those products under different settings. So that's what we're doing here. So what's the first thing I could do as a regulator? I could ban all e-cigarette flavors, right? So fruit, sweet, menthol, banned. What would happen if I did that? Well, fewer people chose e-cigarettes, but I guess worryingly, many more people choose cigarettes. So from a kind of public health point of view, it looks like what you're doing with that policy is shifting people away from e-cigarettes towards combustible cigarettes. And because we know cigarettes are worse for you, that's not a very good thing. So maybe not the best policy. Okay, what else could we do? We could ban menthol combustible cigarettes, right? Keep flavors available in e-cigarettes and ban menthol in combustible cigarettes only. Well, what happens there? We're seeing a reduction in the use of combustible cigarettes and a move towards e-cigarettes, and none is the opt-out. So none is I would choose none of these. So also seeing a move towards, if you can interpret this as cessation, we may not do that, but anyway. But the main point is we're moving away from combustible cigarettes, the most harmful product. Pretty good policy. What else could we do? We could ban all non-tobacco flavors across all products. So menthol cigarettes I could ban, and then menthol fruit e-cigarettes could also ban. What happens there? Seeing a move away from e-cigarettes, slight increase in combustible cigarettes, but a move away from both products as well. So potentially another good policy, but yeah. So just to sum that up, so banning flavors in e-cigarettes encourages the use of combustible cigarettes. Banning menthol in combustible minimises their use, and banning all flavors in both types maximises abstinence, so pushes people away from both products. So yeah, it's a really nice example, I think, of how these things kind of working in practice. So the second case study is some work on food shopping choices that we're doing with colleagues at NDPH. So again, we start with our research question driven by government policy. So the government proposed to ban volume-based price promotions, so kind of 2-for-1s and stuff, on unhealthy food. Try to discourage people buying those unhealthy foods, sort of in bulk buying those things. But at the minute, there's little evidence on how consumers respond to those. So we don't know if this policy would work. Because the bans aren't in place, there's no data to directly model their impact. So that, again, this is where a DCE can come in. We can use a DCE to do exactly that. And that's what we did here. So in terms of our experimental design, we had salience, so how sort of obvious the discount was. We had the depth of promotion, so was it just 25% or was it 50%? And then we had the volume of promotion as well, so kind of the numbers, it like a 2-for-1 or a 4-for-1 or something. And we're testing how these things impacted on people's choices to buy these products. So this is kind of what one of the choice tasks looked like. Of course, it was on unhealthy, but we need healthy products to see if that worked oppositely as well, hence broccoli. I'm not suggesting broccoli is unhealthy at all. We all know that's nonsense. But yeah, so we had our product here. We had the levels of the attributes here, but we had them kind of working in practice here. So buy three, get one free price promotion. And yeah, comparing it to just buying the individual one. So again, I'm not going to present some models today, but I just thought I'd sum them up as we've already seen some before. But we built choice models. So we had our experiment on healthy products and unhealthy products. We built choice models on both of those. And we assessed the likely impact of the government's proposed price promotion ban on the consumption of those unhealthy goods. And that helps us get back to our research question and answer the policy issue at hand. Okay, excuse me. So let's talk about modelling a little bit more. We've seen a couple of worked examples. Let's look a little bit more at the and this is the Apollo package in R as well. So I use this product. I know a lot of my colleagues at Choice Modelers use this product, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for doing so, although you don't have to. It's developed by Choice Modelers for Choice Modelers. It's the guys that lead the field kind of design and implement this package. Because it's based in R, it's free and it's open source, really, really good. Mostly it being free, especially for a lot of details here. It's like comprehensive capabilities, and a very good sort of instruction manual, and a very good forum online where people are very responsive, and there's a nice community to help you work through your issues. And it's got a nice modular structure, which means you can sort of stitch bits together quite nicely, which I'll talk about in a few slides' time. And of course, because it's based in R, it's perfectly integral. It's perfectly possible to integrate other R packages with Apollo as well. And I'm going to show you some of that next as well. So this is kind of, and again, it's probably a bit small, so I apologize if you're like me squinting at it now. But what's nice about Apollo is it has this sort of balance between flexibility and ease of use. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to learn or to get to grips with, but once you've learned the basics, it's very, very easy to then start to use it a little bit more intensely if you want to. But getting hold of the basics isn't that hard, and the basics are perfectly easy to run as well. It's easy to learn, kind of, and you also get the basic features of the model embedded in the code. And from reviewing a lot of journal articles, it can be the case that people perhaps are confused with the structure of the model, but it's much easier to see that once you code it up like this, which is a real advantage in just sort of helping. It certainly helped me understand it when I started coding like this. Because it's modular in nature, you can stitch some of the model structures together. So once you've got all the little bits of it, you can use little bit 1 plus little bit 2 to get little bit 3. But you can, so you can estimate more complicated models that allow you to do all kinds of things. And I'll show you a few examples of that as we go on. But it's a really nice feature of it. And because of the way it's built, it's a feature of it that's very easy to do, which is good. You can open the subscripts. So a lot's going on behind the scenes for you, or a lot of the things that are automated are done to save you hundreds of lines of code. But what's nice about it being R is, of course, you can just look at those. So you can see exactly. So if you are interested in really getting under the bonnet with these models, you can do that in a heartbeat by just using the view command. So yeah, and that'll help you see that, which is really nice. And you can build your own add-ons. So we did lots of things, starting values, loops, or I built a little calibration optimization tool. It doesn't matter what that is precisely, but the point is it's very easy to sort of build your own little sub-functions and integrate those with the rest of the code, and that's really easy to do. And it's, of course, compatible with other packages. So say I wanted to use splines, for example. I could get one of the spline packages from R. I could load it up in my library. I could compute the splines, and I could put them into my utility function. Yeah, then we're done. So yeah, so all of those things are really nice in R, which makes it quite unique, or yeah, in Apollo. So I'm just going to go through a few examples of some models that we've been doing in Apollo. So first, you may recognize this because we saw it a few slides ago, but this is the just the basic MNL model. And again, really straightforward to estimate. It's kind of the basis for all of the other model structures that we use. And if you want to, it's very easy to replicate either in Stata or in Logit or even in Excel. You're building multinomial Logit model like any other multinomial Logit model in the world. Yeah, it's easy to, and that's, I don't know if you guys can see that, but I've put all the links here to the forum where you can get the code for this from Apollo yourself and run it on your own data. The next thing we want to do is, this is just an example of what we call this is real world data calibration. So remember that we said one of the problems is hypothetical bias. So what people tell me they do in experimental setting is not necessarily what they're going to go and do in real world. So one of the ways I might get around that is by sort of calibrating my model. And how I'll do that is taking some real world data and embedding it in my model. And we've done that in a couple of ways here. So again, there are a few ways you can do it. But what we can see is you're getting a massive change here in the predictive probabilities of all of these products as we calibrate the model. So you can see then by embedding this real world data or this real world behavior in our model, we're getting quite a big difference to our estimates. So that suggests that hypothetical bias is in play and suggests that we can correct for it. And it's so it's a really straightforward way. It's a way of doing it in Apollo. Yeah, that's one of the things we're doing here. And here's the code for it for you guys as well. The second example is kind of on the kind of behavioral economics side. So in my tobacco data, on the context of my tobacco data, we're interested in addiction. So if I just use a straightforward model, it assumes away addiction. In other words, what you're saying is smokers' tobacco choices aren't really governed by the extent to which they're addicted to cigarettes. And I don't think I'd have to work very hard to convince people that wasn't the best assumption in the world. But what I can do with a series of equations is that I can collect lots of data on smokers' level of addiction in my survey. And this is these things here. So whether or not they're a daily smoker and how many cigarettes they smoke per day and all that kind of stuff. And then from that, I can build up a sort of variable of addiction. And then I can embed that addiction or interact it in my model for preference. I can see how preferences vary as a function of addiction. And with that, get a much more realistic picture of smokers' choice behavior. And this is where it sort of makes quite a big difference, or we can see it makes quite a big difference. This is willingness to pay, and it's varying as a function of addiction, or willingness to pay for nicotine at the various levels. And what we can see here is there's a huge variation in how much smokers are willing to pay as a function of addiction. And for understanding policy and for understanding the impact of policies, that's really important. But yeah, and here we're using several model functions, and here are the codes for you. Okay, so just to sum up, so DCEs can be a really useful tool for studying health behaviours. Lots and lots of docs in the literature. If you just type in DCE and health to Google Scholar, you'll be swimming in them. It's not a silver bullet, subject to a bunch of limitations. Can be applied across a range of settings, which is really helpful. Very flexible with respect to the research questions that we could ask. And yeah, lots of different models are available to do all sorts of wonderful things about trying to understand the way that people make choices and how that's important for policy in trying to understand research questions that we might be interested in.